For more on the topic, the relations between the tiger and the dragon, we are joined in the studio in Beijing, Mr. Liu Youfa, who until last year was serving as the Chinese Consul General in Mumbai, and he's with us as an analyst today. In New Delhi, we have Mr. Jay Panda, a member of the Indian Parliament. Welcome as well. And in Washington, D.C. is Mr. Donald Camp, a former American diplomat who has served for India and also on the issue of China as well. Welcome to all the three of you, gentlemen. This is a big day for China and India. Therefore, I would like to address the question as the host of the program to our Indian panelists. Let me ask you, Mr. Panda, several things seems to be on the top priorities of the Indian minds dealing with China. Border issue, trade imbalance, relations with Pakistan, and of course, you also have some questions about China's One Belt, One Road. Some Indians believe it is circling, quote unquote, India. Have any of these issues so far by the two leaders of two sides, been resolved or actually better understood?
Well, I think we are in the process of a much better understanding. Prime Minister Modi is familiar with China. Long before he was Prime Minister, he has visited many times and he admires China. And I think the two leaders have struck up a rapport, which you can see in the reciprocity. When the Chinese president was here, he was also in Mr. Modi's home state in Gujarat. Some of these issues are long-standing, they go back many decades. Some are more recent, such as the trade deficit. But I think the biggest issue is if we can have a rapport and better trust between the two leaders and the two countries, we can make progress on all of these fronts.
All right. You talk about the strategic ones without going specific, but I would like to go specific with you, Mr. Liu, here in Beijing. First of all, the two sides have agreed to increase the so-called border checkpoints and the exchange points. Now currently it's 4, but it's likely to increase to further. Secondly, the two sides have also decided to establish so-called military hotline between the two countries. And thirdly, it seems that both sides have been hearing each other on the economic and trade issues. What are the concerns coming from China to our Indian guests?
First of all, the leaders of the two countries have made the strategic decisions. What I want to stress is the political decisions or the strategic decisions would not mean much unless we carry forward to expedite the process of transforming the political decisions into strategic, specific policy decisions. This is what we want to see more to happen from both sides.
Okay, you put it also in a very diplomatic way. Let me just be a little bit more on your point. We see the Chinese President Xi Jinping received Mr. Modi at the very beginning in his hometown in the province of Shanxi. Meanwhile, later, the Chinese Prime Minister Premier Li Keqiang also met with Prime Minister Modi. The Prime Minister was talking about, quote, two working together could make sure that there's going to be more fair and more balanced the global political and economic system. If I read that quote well. The thing is, how to achieve that?
First, let me just be specific. We identify the areas for cooperation. And secondly, we need to adopt operational policy measures. And third, we should identify more projects. I think projects have been signed, 24 agreements were just signed shortly. Number 5 is we need to see early results because during my experience there in India, agreements could be signed, but it will take a long time for them to translate into concrete results.
Okay, let me go to you, Mr. Panda. Help us to understand how much will what Mr. Liu just mentioned be implemented. I really need to get your perspective. First of all, translating them into specific projects. Secondly, make sure those projects are going to work and be implemented. Thirdly, we're going to have some early harvest to make sure it's going to push the relations forward. Any of those points you want to elaborate on?
Yes, as far as India is concerned, we have a historic opportunity because Prime Minister Modi has the largest mandate in more than 3 decades in India's parliament, and he is known as a go-getter who delivers results if you go by his past track record as an administrator. And similarly, our understanding is that the Chinese president is also has probably the most influence in a very long time, and so considering the seriousness that both are giving to this relationship, Mr. Modi has lived up to his intention of visiting China within his first 1 year, as did the Chinese president. I'm hopeful actually, but if we look at the track record, we have always had 2 steps forward and 1 step back. There are some irritants that we need to sort out, particularly where agreement has been reached earlier, but it still continues to be pinpricks. But I think despite some of these issues, I'm confident that we will make progress, particularly on the trade and investment front.
Some of our audience may wonder, when we have a discussion about China-India relations, why we are also having an American panelist with us. Let me tell you about the purpose. Let me ask you, first of all, Mr. Kemp, a question. We talk about China-India relations. People talk about a lack of strategic trust. And reasons of that lack of strategic trust, of course, varies. One of those, some say, has a lot to do with the United States' role in terms of its relations with India and in terms of its strategic goals in Asia. Your response?
Well, I think that the U.S. Relationship with India is a very important one to us, as is the U.S. relationship with China. And they do not need to be in any sort of confrontation. Our relationship with India is very important. It stands on its own. And we have a lot of interest in the United States in seeing, frankly, better relations between China and India. Less tensions on the border are good for the world. Cooperation, as we saw in this visit, on climate change is good for us and good for the world. So I don't think there's an inherent contradiction here between good U.S.-China relations and U.S.-India as far as the progress of India-China relations.
Mr. Liu, did you hear it very clearly? Mr. Kemp is simply saying, don't blame Washington if you don't have a very good relations. What you say?
I want to add, it's up for the leaders of each and every 3 countries to make the decisions which would first best serve his country and for the common interest. Because currently the relationship between or among countries are not supposed to stand on the Cold War fashions, on the values or the political rhetorics. Rather, we are supposed to stand together and to push for the common development. So the convergence of interests is what we all need to look at.
Okay, let's talk about strategic. If you say that's exactly what you're thinking. Some suggest China has not been, over the years, even decades, giving enough significance to its relations with India as India and China deserve. Do you think this is a right statement or actually too much exaggeration of the real situation?
I would not accept this conclusion.
Explain.
First of all, China and India have joined hands and complicated a lot of things. The 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, the BRICS, and the kind of collective salvation during the financial crisis, and the AIIB and things, the Silk Road things. We've come together. But I think we do have to look at certain things which have been neglected.
Like what?
The mutual understanding. The Chinese sides and the Indian sides both have to outreach to the other side. Lack of outreaching is one thing. And second, the kind of massive participation is lacking, the second. And the third is the mass media. I do suppose, I can say this for sure, the mass media from both sides are not working 100% behind the government.
Okay, let me ask you, Mr. Panda. They always blame the media. It's okay, they blame us, that's okay. But the thing is, what do you think is the thing that India should look at when it comes to the relationship with China, particularly for the future? Should India, as some believe, still look at China as a strategic rival? For example, India put China into, quote, a special category. Any kinds of trade and economic deals between the two countries will be specially examined, such as with the country of Pakistan, with the country of Afghanistan, and also some of the others. So is India categorizing China in a very special way and not necessarily a totally friendly way? Mr. Panda.
Well, look, we see China as an opportunity, but as well, of course, it has certain strategic concerns for us. Let us not forget that there has been a war between our two countries 50 years ago, and there are still unresolved issues regarding the borders. So obviously, it is natural to have concerns. Now, as regards countries like Pakistan, we don't grudge Pakistan's growth, and we don't grudge China having a relationship with Pakistan, but we do have concerns about cross-border terrorism from Pakistan, and we believe China also has or ought to have similar concerns about terrorism.
I see.
And we need to come to a common understanding of how to deal with such issues. And if we can, then I think we can bridge the trust deficit that still lingers.
Right.
But don't forget, China is already India's largest trading partner. So there are two sides to the coin.
Right, there are two sides to the coin. One of the sides is exactly very exciting because cultural ties and people-to-people contact seems to be a very big topic of conversation when it comes to China-Indian ties. Let's take tourism, for example. Let's take a look at this. 100 million tourists from China went abroad last year. 5 million of them went to South Korea. The US got 2 million, but only 200,000 went to India. Think about that difference. Modi today, President Modi, Prime Minister Modi rather, announced a relaxing of visa restrictions for Chinese tourists. They can now access electronic visa online and no longer need to queue up at embassies. The key thing is, Mr. Panda, will a relaxation about the way to get the visa necessarily to really bring our hearts better, closer, and together? Mr. Panda, briefly from you.
Well, we believe, and Prime Minister Modi has articulated this, that people-to-people contact is very important. Although we have thousands of years old culture on both sides, recent contacts have not been very high, as you yourself pointed out. But India was not very open to tourists from anywhere, and Prime Minister Modi has been changing that during the last 1 year. And we believe that, and this was a unilateral step that India took without a matching Chinese step. So you can see that India is willing to go halfway or more as necessary to build the relationship. We think it will lead to benefits as more Chinese visit India.
Well, certainly this should be applauded. Mr. Liu, you stayed in India for a very long time as the Consul General. Is the step a real step toward better?
Definitely, this is a starting point, the electronic visa application. Secondly, we need to have more infrastructure so that Chinese tourists would find it easy to travel. For many historical sites, with 200 kilometers, it would take 3 hours or 4 hours. It would dent the interest of the tourists.
I see.
And we should have more tourists or tourist guide who know how to speak Chinese.
Those are very detailed issues. You've already mapped them out. I'm sure the policymakers should consider all of them. But Mr. Camp, you've been listening very attentively, smiled at times if I read your face expression right. Let me ask you this final question before we go. When China and India, together with other emerging economies, work together, it might bring a lot of complementaries and even changes to somewhat extent to the current international system. Is the US going to embrace that? Or just like AIIB, is it going to despise that or have to wait a long time before showing any attitude? Mr. Camp.
That's a very good question. I think that it is always tough for emerging powers like China and India to deal with an international system that is already well established and make their own efforts to adapt it to their needs. I think the U.S. is willing to do so, and in fact, on the AIIB particularly, Our Secretary of the Treasury recently said that the U.S. would welcome the new bank, assuming it adheres to international norms of governance and environmental regulation, as I'm sure it will, or intends to.
All right.
And so I think that we are moving in the direction of that kind of acknowledgement.
We are moving in that direction. Using that quote, I would like to ask you, Mr. Liu, final words from you and our Indian guest. Which direction are we moving? How fast are we moving on this one of the most important bilateral relations, China and India?
Yeah. China, India would have to stick together. We have a saying, unite, we stand. Disunite, we fall. So we need to join hands. With the concrete projects, we move forward.
Can you imagine that, Mr. Panda? The tiger and also the dragon together walking hand in hand? What do you think needs to be done?
Indeed. Indeed, we have many shared interests. We have many shared concerns. And I'd like to say two things in ending. One is, none of these relationships are a zero-sum game. Our closeness with America should not matter to China, just like China's closeness to Pakistan is not truly what drives our relationship. And finally, on the opportunities front, it is unlimited between India and China. On the hurdles front, we should remember, we are saying in India that you cannot clap with one hand. You need both sides to clap. And that's what we need to keep in mind to resolve some of these hurdles.
All right, elephant and dragon can work together. Well, that's good news. Jay Panda from India, Liu Youfa here in China, and also Donald Kemp in the United States. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. This is a big day, of course, for China and India.